There you go. Good morning, everybody. My name is Sheoran. I am the Vice President of Global Development at ETR and also the Managing Director of YTH. Super excited to have all of you and our panelists on this opening plenary of YTH Live 2020. I'm very, very excited to bring you this panel session where we'll be talking to three young people and youth adult leaders who are leading the fight against climate change. Along with the COVID pandemic, the racial justice movements like Black Lives Matter, climate change is the leading worldwide issue that we are facing that's impacting all of us and our lives. And young people have taken the lead in this. So let me welcome and introduce you to the panelists that are going to be talking to me in today's session. There you go. So we have three panelists. Let me start with Natalie Mebane. Natalie was introduced to the power of grassroots organizing after attending the Power Shift conference in 2007, where as a new graduate with an environmental degree, it wasn't enough for her to know why climate change was the greatest threat to human civilization. She needed to organize to combat it. And she's done that very, very well, if I may say. She is on the board of directors of the Power Shift Network and Young Voices for the Planet. She works with young people across the country to build a powerful and inclusive movement of activists leading the way to a just and sustainable future. She was a Dirty Fuels lobbyist for the National Sierra Club from 2015 till 2019. And today, as the US Policy Director of 350.org, she works to influence our policy through the federal government to phase out fossil fuels and justly transition to an economy run by 100% clean and renewable energy. Our next panelist is Jessica Olson. Jessica holds a degree in both environmental and feminist studies, and she's a longtime advocate for the connections between gender and climate change. She's a senior climate lead for the Sierra Club's Gender Equity and Environment Program, where she works for justice-centered human mobility and young feminist climate action. And finally, Sohayla Eldeeb is a freshman at Stanford University who also serves as the Zero Hour Director of Global Outreach and Relations. Zero Hour is a youth-led movement that has organized marches and lobby days in Washington, DC and around the world in over 25 locations. She manages over 200 chapters around the world, including ones in Iran, Colombia, India, Kenya, Australia, etc. Since DC, Zero Hour has launched into a prominent national youth climate movement that has put on a youth climate summit in Miami, Florida, led impactful social media campaigns, testified before Congress, and most recently helped coordinate the climate change strikes around the world. Aside from her activism, Sohayla has pursued environmental research, focusing on oil spills and finding a novel way of cleaning them up sustainably. So with that, welcome panelists. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Before I ask you the first question, I want to let the attendees know that they can actually chat their questions and comments in the chat section so that our panelists can actually look at those and respond to them in real time. All right, let's start. I want to kick off by asking each of you, we read your bios, but I really want to hear from you in your own words. How did you get into climate change activism and what have you been doing over the last few years? And maybe I can ask Natalie to go first.
Definitely. Thank you so much for having me here. So I started doing this work, I would say, I kind of think of different origin stories. I would say it probably really started my first day of high school, senior year of high school. I was in AP environmental science class. It was the first year that it was offered in the country as AP. And that's the day I discovered my major. I was, obviously it's going to start applying to colleges soon. And I didn't know what I was going to study. I knew that some of the things I liked. But from that moment on, I opened my textbook on the first day of senior year. And just from reading the first page, I realized that environmental science wasn't just about the natural world. It was as much about how humans interact with our world. And it was just as much about social justice as it was about anything else. And so I finally saw that it was a field that combined everything that I care about. So from there, went on to University of Maryland, College Park, got my degree in environmental science and policy. And soon after that, as I mentioned in my bio, went to that conference put on by, at the time it was called Energy Action Coalition. Now it's called Power Shift Network. And that's where I saw that there was this whole world called grassroots organizing. And I was like, what is this? And it was very exciting. And I also found from that conference lobbying, because we went lobbying for the very first time. It was volunteer. And I was like, ooh, I like this. I'm going to keep doing this. And so that was November 5th, 2007. And so from then on, just kept it up and started doing it volunteer, honestly, just going to every and all lobby days that I could get my hands on. Eventually, I also became a grassroots organizer for different nonprofits, learning, talking to strangers on the street, pretty much, right? Running campaigns, and then went on to get my master's in sustainability. And then when I came back to the US, then I was like, I'm going to really make this a career at some point. I'm going to make it work. And so jump ahead a few years, eventually became the dirty fuels lobbyist at Sierra Club, working on oil and gas and pipelines and everything that I say few of my favorite things to destroy. So then from there, just a year ago, July 22nd was actually my 1-year anniversary at 350 as the policy director. So that was the best short summary I could come up with right now of how this entered, how I kind of came to be.
Thank you so much, Natalie. That's an amazing journey. Sohayla, would you like to share your journey with us?
Of course. Yeah, my journey started pretty young as well. Around 13, I'm actually born in Egypt, and I grew up there for about 5 years. And we try to visit it every summer. So around 13, I was in Egypt, and I realized that the Nile that I grew up in front of was getting more dirtier and more polluted. So my environmental initiative actually started there in Egypt, just to me, because I thought the US was way more developed and way more ahead than other countries on environmental initiatives, to which I later find out obviously it's not. We have a long way to go. But yeah, so I started there. I implemented a climate curriculum for elementary students, and from there I came back to the US obviously for school, and I was doing oil spills research during my time in high school, to where I found that the US really does have a long way to go. So I tried to search for a climate nonprofit, to which I joined this nonprofit called Care About Climate. And then from there, I was connected to Zero Hour, because Zero Hour was just about starting. And they said, this is a whole youth-led initiative. This is where you deserve to be, this is where you fit. And from there, I started coordinating sister chapters. And then here we are now with chapters across the world and still working.
That's amazing. And the fact that you started so early, oh my God, that's quite incredible. Thank you, Sohayla. Jessica, on to you.
Sure. Thank you all so much for having us today. It's really lovely to be on this panel with two really amazing people that I, admire and love to work with. I also got started quite young, still not 30, so still technically youth under the UN. But essentially I started wanting to protect the environment because I saw what was happening to the Pacific Ocean, which is my love growing up not far out of the San Francisco Bay Area. But really took a turn towards focusing on more of the social justice aspects when I learned just how much the climate crisis was being fueled by different corporations and different economic and political systems that were also fueling rampant social injustices as well. And was inspired to take on a gender and feminist lens with a college course I took called Ecofeminisms and Queer Green, taught by the queer feminist disability scholar Allison Kafer, which completely changed my life and my outlook. And around the same time, I was a volunteer with the Sierra Student Coalition, which was the youth chapter of the Sierra Club. And so around 2011, 2012, started really scaling up my activism from the local level against the Keystone XL pipeline when I was living in Texas, to the national level, looking at what our policies were, similar to Natalie with Power Shift and any of those other kind of national ways of organizing youth power for climate action, to then being a youth delegate to the United Nations climate negotiations between 2012 and 2015, really pushing the United States government and delegation to take responsibility for our contributions to climate change. And now kind of turned my volunteer activism into a job with the Sierra Club's gender program, where a lot of my work is still exploring those gaps where we don't actually pay attention to how gender and climate change intersect, or where are the pieces of information where we need to expand that. So a lot of my work recently has been pushing for a feminist agenda for a Green New Deal, with a fantastic coalition of folks across the country and also globally, and supporting a youth fellowship program, continuing to support youth activists in the United States to do feminist climate action, because the youth hold the power when it comes to making change on climate justice.
And Jessica, that's a fantastic segue into my first question, which I'm actually going to direct to Sohayla. Sohayla, as a youth leader yourself, why do you think youth leadership is so important within the climate change movement? And what are your impressions on how that has evolved over the past few years?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, youth leadership, specifically in the climate movement, has become so significant and so important because it's so personal to a lot of youth. It's literally fighting for our own futures. And I think a lot of youth see no future if they don't see a solution or actions taken to combat the climate crisis and the other intersectional issues with it. Additionally, I've seen a lot of growth, specifically with the strikes and just climate, like, it's just, I wouldn't call it a trend, I just call it like more people have been realizing or waking up, specifically youth, that it's not just the Save the Turtles movement, it's a movement that's very real and very intersected with so many different issues, and that specifically even during this pandemic or the Black Lives Matter movement, there's just so many different intersections that people have been realizing they could do more than one issue at a time. And that's why I've seen a lot of youth from different backgrounds come in to the movement and want to get involved in any way possible. And it's been really eye-opening, but there is definitely still a long way to go. We're trying to build an intergenerational movement because at best that's how we can really see solutions. But it's really, really good seeing so many youth rise up and try to get involved in any way that they can across the world.
Thank you, Sohayla. And you mentioned intersectionality, and that I think I want to bring it back to Jessica. You talked about your the intersectionality of feminist action with climate justice. I'd love for you to share a little bit more about how young feminist action has transformed the conversation on climate justice.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think the important thing to think about when talking about where and how young feminists have transformed the conversation on climate justice is that climate justice is not something that we can change just in one location, right? Everyone has the power to change and to contribute to climate action, but we also need to be sure that we're creating broad sweeping coalitions and also building our movements, because there are more than just moments for creating that change. It's long-term sustained action, strategy, and relationships. And so when I think about all of the work that I've done over the last decade with youth and young feminists around the world, a lot of our work is really making sure that we focus on who is doing the work and why they're doing the work, and making sure that folks are both seen, supported, and heard. And what that means is often we're calling attention to the fact that a lot of young folks of color, whether they're Black, Indigenous, or any other background or ethnicity, are likely not the ones that are actually being heard or being able to tell their stories and being centered in that. Especially young queer and trans folks, always marginalized in these conversations as well. Folks who are disabled are also not in the forefront of the conversations. Disability justice activists have just as much at stake in talking about climate justice as everyone else does. And we have so much to think about in terms of what does it look like to root our work in care? Because if we don't care for one another, we're not going to be able to sustain the amount of action we need long term. So what does it look like for us to think about, we have to bridge where the theories and these kinds of academic conversations around climate are and what this action has to practically look like for us long term to keep up the fight, because it is a long-term problem that requires long-term building.
Thank you, Jessica. And that makes complete sense. Absolutely. When I was studying communication and behavior change, one of the things that was often drilled into our heads was to make sustainable change, you have to make changes at the individual person level, at the social community level, and then at the legal law level. And talking about the law level, in the introduction that I gave you for Natalie, we talked about her policy advocacy work in changing policies at the federal level. So Natalie, just want to ask you, what role can young people play in supporting your policy advocacy work and maybe not just with your work, but in general, policy advocacy work, what is a role that you foresee or can visualize for young people?
Well, definitely. I think really, honestly, the answer is that everybody plays a role. I think that the main thing is that there is no age requirement or age limit to lobby or to advocate for what you want. I think that honestly, seeing kids lobby is really inspiring. I've actually been working with Sohayla now for the last 2.5 years. We've been working together in 0 Hour. I'm adult mentor for 0 Hour as well, and a co-founder of the National Children's Campaign. And the whole idea behind it is that young people can also lead, and young people can also be at the forefront. And so in terms of, working towards a just transition and getting off of fossil fuels, my first time going on a lobby day was when I was fresh out of college, 22, and wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I just knew that I had to change something. And then by being introduced to advocacy, by being introduced to the fact that our federal government does work for us and that it doesn't have to just work for large corporations, is what gave me sort of the motivation to keep going and to really see that this is going to be my path that I choose to change the laws that I don't want. It is very empowering to know that if there's a law out there you do not like, you can change it. If there's a law that you want to create, you can write it. And it's really nice writing laws and writing bills with young people. One of the young people I work with, he writes, his name's Jonah, he writes bills for fun, just on a weekend. He's like, here's some bills I created. And then he edits bills for fun. He actually just got some edits into a bill that's coming out soon. He texted me today. He was very excited. He's like, they accepted my edits. So some of his edits are going to be, if we pass that bill, going to be law, hopefully. So that's really exciting. But I think that the main thing is that showing people from an early age that this work is their job too. And that whether you're doing it as a volunteer outside of school or whether you're just doing it as a volunteer, as a working adult, you can make it happen. And the best way really is to find organizations that really represent you, that you feel like are in line with your beliefs and what you're fighting for, and working with them on a volunteer basis. And if it does become your career, if that is something you want to do, finding the organizations or even starting your own that really represent what you're going to be fighting for.
Thank you, Natalie. That's fantastic. And thank God for people who love to write bills and are good at it, because where would we be without people like those? So kudos, and wherever they are, know that our hearts are with you. And thank you for everything that you do. As you know, YTH, Youth Tech Health, technology is in the name, and this conference also talks about youth health and technology as a core feature of this gathering and this platform. So I want to take a conversation a little bit towards that. So I want to open up this conversation, this question to all three of you, and so you can answer in no particular order. What role do you think technology has played or can play in amplifying youth activism for climate change? Just share with us some of your thoughts, some experiences you might have had, or some advice that you might want to give us.
I guess, is this for who is this for? Sorry, I wasn't sure who it was for.
I think it's
all
for
three of you, no particular order. Please go ahead and start jumping in.
I mean, I can give a little. So because technology has just been so significant in the growth of 0 Hour and specifically youth movement. And I think referring back to the question about how youth are just getting more involved and how it evolved through the years is because of social media and technology. It's such a powerful tool when used right or when used correctly. It's an agent of change where you can put a lot of information out there and truly educate people. Like that's how we found people that built up our team, and that's how we're educating people about how the climate crisis issue is not just a scientific issue. It's not just a climate focused issue. It's something that's intersectional. So technology has just been so important. It's where we grow most of our audience, specifically for 0 Hour, and it's where we kind of hit it off because like we did put on the first youth-led march in Washington, D.C., but that was just like a starting point. It was the fact that it was blasted on social media, it was the fact that it was like published in articles. It reached way more people than we intended. And that's really where it took off. And we just started getting like inside advice and just people like reaching out saying, we saw what you did and we're here with you and we're supporting you, even though we weren't there in person. And that's really what you can do with technology. And I think we're seeing it best right now during this pandemic, where everyone is kind of forced to open their eyes to technology and, you know, adapt their, whether it's conferences, meetings, or just anything over the internet and within like your household. And it's been really eye-opening to see how things have just developed and how we're trying to adapt in these times using technology. So yeah.
I would just say, you know, there are very few tools that I think that are as utilized as like Google Docs for climate activists. Like my life is on Google Docs when it comes to organizing. Do you have a coalition? I will build you a 20-tab mission control document that's been color coded for our timelines, how we're gonna coordinate all of these different actions. I mean, the biggest issue with that was when we were doing, back in 2014, a bilateral youth statement on the US and China's involvement in the UN negotiations. We couldn't use Google Docs with our youth allies in China. So we had to figure out what not to do off Google Docs, and that just threw us through a loop because we're so dependent upon, you know, these inexpensive, easy to navigate and use tools to build our power. And I will also say, you know, in addition to the tools that make organizing more accessible for us, like Sohayla said, a lot of social media and these different platforms are building the momentum we need to build our power. I don't think we would be where we were in this conversation if it weren't for the live features on a lot of these different platforms in so many different movements, not just climate justice movements, but all different social justice movements. The ability to transparently show what is happening in real time is just, it's inestimable power. And there's also just so much to be said to how spaces that are traditionally inaccessible, like the UN climate negotiations, are now more accessible because we have the technology to make them so. When I was unable to have a speaker from a frontline community get a visa and go through the process to fly to a different country that was not really accepting of getting a visa from that person from that country, we were able to have them call in and still be able to speak and tell their own story. So there are ways that these tools are creating that space for us to really understand what is actually happening real time in places where climate impacts are already the worst, and get voices out. And similar to what I spoke to earlier about folks, especially folks across the gender spectrum, a lot of non-traditional media or social media is really key for amplifying the specific narratives of folks who continue to be pushed to the margin of what we continue to hear in terms of narratives around climate change.
Thanks, Jessica. Natalie, do you have something to add to that?
Sure. I would say one thing, I mean, what we're using right now, of course, Zoom. I think that, you know, just having the ability to video conference from around the world, it is so efficient. And being able to just have anyone in your family room in your meeting any time of day, you know, it's really changed the world. Especially, of course, yes, Google Docs. If that ever crashed, we would be in trouble because we would lose everything that we have and all our planning. I think that the way that the world is more interconnected today is we have to rely on technology to organize. Because it's not enough to just organize, you know, in your own country or in your own town. The climate change affects the whole world. And so we have to be able to see what's happening up to the minute across the world. You know, right now, I was reading an article today that Wuhan, China, which is where the original, you know, cases of coronavirus hit, are going through record flooding right now. And so at the same time of dealing with one pandemic, one major issue, they are now having record flooding, which, as you know, from things related to climate change, obviously increases the risk of major floods, major fires, major everything. And so everything's interconnected, and one disaster doesn't stop the next. So having a pandemic doesn't stop the chances of there being a major flood. And having that information and knowledge immediately because of technology, because of the internet, I am now able to even learn more of what's happening in the world around me. I have to think about the world around me every single day. And we just don't have the choice anymore for what's happening worldwide not to, because if anything, this pandemic has shown us that we are all so connected. And so we have to be paying attention. And I think that's just happy to be able to be at a time to organize when we have these tools.
Thanks, Natalie. And you've raised some very important points. Everything is connected, and anything that happens in other parts of the world impacts us. And that leads me to my next question, which is, no, I understand that COVID is linked to climate change, but I'm often struggling to explain that linkage and that intersectionality to other folks. So as I have you three experts with me here today. Can you share with us some thoughts on how COVID is linked to climate change and why it's so important to highlight this intersectionality? Natalie, can we start with you?
So the way that what coronavirus really shows us is not so much that it was, of course, it wasn't caused by climate change, but what it shows us is that the vulnerabilities of climate change amplify in any problem. So for example, in communities that, and this has already been studied and found, that communities that are severely have hazardous air, environmental justice communities, places that have high levels of air pollution from, factories, refineries, all these other sources of pollution, the residents there have had so many years with their lungs being completely damaged from breathing in this toxic air pollution for decades, that those who get coronavirus are much more likely to die from it, because it's a lung, it's a disease that attacks a lot of the body, but one of the main places, of course, is the lungs. And so if you live in a community that already is more likely to kill you anyway because of the pollution, you're more likely to die from coronavirus. Also, those communities are typically lower income communities, Black and brown communities. So they're more likely to be in the category of what we're calling essential workers, people who don't have the option to work from home, sitting in front of their computer all day. They have to be outside. They have to be in community with other people. Whatever work that they're doing, they cannot do it from home. And so they're more likely to be exposed to the disease. So you get more likely to be exposed because of the economic factors there. All right. And as well as related to race and discrimination and everything that's connected with race and class. And then on top of that, if they are exposed and they catch it, they're more likely to die. Also, in the US, as you know, we do not have universal health care. Healthcare is not equal depending on who you are. It's based completely on your income, your job, all of that. And so you are now you're already perhaps a lower income person, you're sick, and then you can't even get the care that you need. You can't even afford the care. You're maybe avoiding going to the hospital, or when you do go to the hospital, you're turned away. And so you're more likely to die as well. And so it's just overall, it compounds it. And I think what it does, coronavirus has shown that the inequities of this world, across the world, not just in the US, have always been there. But it was so easy and convenient to ignore before now. And I think that one thing that is coming from this is that it's very difficult to turn a blind eye to how it's always been, especially our healthcare system. So in terms of related to climate change, I think what we have to show ourselves is that climate change has not slowed down, paused, stopped, or anything. Wuhan, China is experiencing climate change related floods as we speak. And they are still having to recover from everything that's happened with coronavirus. And that's just how it goes. When California fires start kicking in, for those in California, I know, Jessica, you're in California, that doesn't pause because of coronavirus. And so now the governor is going to have to deal with the double emergency of people evacuating and being in close quarters and perhaps evacuation zones on top of having the virus spread. How do you evacuate a hospital with terminally, ill patients that are sick from coronavirus? Like that, these are all the things that none of us want to think about because they're so stressful, but that they're happening. And I think that we have to look at it as how do we deal with both? And we can't fight one or the other. We have to fight them simultaneously.
Thank you, Natalie. Those are very powerful messages. Thank you for sharing those. Jessica and Sohayla, do you have any other thoughts you want to add?
I mean, sorry. I mean, Natalie put it like perfectly. I think the pandemic basically exposed everything that a lot of climate activists and organizers are trying to pinpoint that the climate crisis will, you know, even like make more extreme. Like it exposed that the pandemic targets low income and people of color communities, that a lot of our systems are really, really not equal whatsoever. And I think moving forward, what the government should do and what organizers and leaders that have the power is to look to the future and say, okay, the pandemic is already causing us trouble. What can we invest in, or what can we help that will, you know, help us towards a green or a sustainable or a better future, so that if another catastrophe hits, which the climate crisis will, we won't face it in this factor, like this extremeness. And yeah, and what I see is like a lot of politicians or a lot of leaders are investing or buying out like things that are causing these inequities. So instead of doing that, think ahead, think the fact that we have like less than 10 years when the climate crisis will endure so many different consequences. So why don't we start thinking ahead and start investing and start like planning for another catastrophe possibly, or another pandemic, and not have to face it the way that we are right now. So yeah, I mean, it's like literally exposing everything, like all the facts and all of like the evidence is right there. It's just a matter of what do we do next.
Thanks, Sohayla. Jessica?
Yeah, I mean, both Sohayla and Natalie spoke to it so well. I think that my one contribution will be that just to say, climate change is a threat multiplier. We already know that. Where there are existing and entrenched inequalities, climate change exacerbates those. And we are seeing that this pandemic is doing something very similar, but at a much more rapid and apparent pace. So thinking about everything that is causing complications right now, looking at further social, economic, racial, and gendered injustices that are occurring right now as a result of both the response, but also the physical complications of having and spreading COVID-19, that is not far off from what, you know, unrestricted climate impacts will and does actually already look like in many places, in terms of whether folks have access to safe housing, whether folks have access to jobs so they're able to access the, you know, healthcare, like Natalie pointed to. Just thinking through the ways that the response to COVID-19, the answer is collective action. We all need to do what we can to protect ourselves, but also to protect others. When I wear a mask, I'm not protecting myself, I'm protecting you. And that's the same and very similar to climate action. When I am doing climate action, I'm not only protecting myself, I am also protecting you. I live in the United States, one of the biggest emitters. I'm going to see less impacts, even though every fall I need to have an N95 mask to prevent the smoke from damaging my lungs from wildfires near my house, which now I won't be able to access because we need to save those N95s for medical frontline workers, right? I'm not going to see the brunt of climate impacts because of my position, my privileges, and where I live. But a lot of my friends and people I build coalition with are and will. And it's our responsibility to take action collectively because it's a collective action problem, very similarly. So I see these as a lot of relationships in terms of how we take action and how we need to come together to create the best solutions moving forward. And both require recovery processes that are centered on justice and actually listening to the communities that are most harmed as to what needs to be done in these recovery processes, both from COVID-19, but also from climate impacts.
Thank you, Jessica. Those are really important intersectionality issues, and the the impact on vulnerable communities that's amplified in climate change and other health issues. That's obviously quite clear. I feel that we are barely scratching the surface here, but unfortunately, time is limited. I feel that I could spend hours and hours in this conversation with all three of you, but because of time, I'm going to pose one last question to all three of you, which is, as we sort of close out this conversation, what is one final message or piece of advice or point that you want to share and leave with our participants? Jessica, would you like to go first?
Sure. having been a youth activist for a while, one thing that's always frustrated me is people saying that youth are the future. And I just really want to impress on people that youth are here now. Youth are already saying what needs to happen now. Climate impacts are also not just in the future, they are now. So one really simple way to show up for climate action is to trust the leadership of youth, especially young women of color, especially young trans folks, especially folks coming from impacted communities. These youth know what they're talking about. We have the solutions, and we've been at the forefront of calling and saying what needs to be done for a long time. And you know, on top of that, just like hashtag trust Black women, hashtag trans women are women, Black Lives Matter. Like there's so many other pieces that are all tied into this, but mainly trust youth.
Sohayla, you want to go next?
Yes, I mean, Jessica put it perfectly. And also, like, just talking about how we need collective action, like anyone, at least just do your simple part of educating yourself. And you may come upon like things that you read, or the more you educate yourself, the more you may feel uncomfortable because you realize that you may have privileges. And that should actually encourage you and not discourage you. It just encourage yourself to do more and take part in whatever it may be. There's always something going around in all different communities. And if there isn't, then find out how you may play a role in that. But yes, and like Jessica said, like so many different issues that we are seeing right now are so intersected and interconnected. Black Lives Matter specifically, like a lot of the work really acknowledges the fact that we have to like focus on multiple things. It's not like you pick and choose the issue that you're affected by. No, like you can fight for issues that you may yourself not be affected by, but it's the fact that you have the privilege and the resources to do so should encourage you to do it most.
Thanks, Sohayla. Natalie, can we close out with you?
Absolutely. I would say, you know, just start now. I would say don't think of this as something that you'll do one day, because the future is not promised. I would say that regardless of what age you are, there you can't, you know, if you've had a whole career and you're like, I've never done anything like this before, that's okay. Start now, because this has to be an intergenerational movement. It affects all life on Earth. I mean, we're talking about the, you know, continuation of human civilization. And it is that dire. And it's not to sound alarmist. If you're not alarmed, you're not paying attention. So if the idea of, you know, what happens in the next, what the IPCC said that we have to do these things by these dates, those are all really guesses. Those are all hopes. Those are all, if we do these things, maybe we'll have a chance. In fact, there was a 66% chance to stay below 1.5 if we do all these things by 2030, which we have not started, by the way. And we already missed the 2020 deadlines for stuff. So, because we can tell we're not on track for those deadlines. And so the idea is that, you know, right now for the climate, we are actually fighting to stay around and to keep the world running as we've become used to. So I would say whatever you do is just start your activism now, and whatever level. It does not have to be advocacy directly on the Hill or anything like that. It could be in any way that you can contribute, whether it's music, art, or just even talking to family and friends and voting. Don't forget, there is this special thing happening in November. Yep. And you can make a difference. So do that, make that difference.
That's a fantastic way to, I think, end our panel. You know, everybody out there who's listening, or even those who are not listening and might hear about this panel through second or third level dissemination, mobilize, join the groups that are being led by our three panelists, and vote. November is critical. Climate change is an urgent fight. It's you know, this window that we have, it's not going to be open for long. You know, go out there, make that difference. And with that, I want to close out the panel. I want to thank all three of you, Jessica, Sohayla, Natalie. Thank you so much for being on the panel here with us today. For all the attendees, if you have questions for them, please feel free to chat on the chat platform next to this session. And I hope that they will be around for other parts of the conference as well. So you could even find them in the networking lounge at some part of time or another and interact and exchange thoughts and views with them. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Yeah. Thanks.
Absolutely.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.